All right, let's see what we got here. Well, again, if you want to follow, I do publish the notes every week, so that for those of you that are visual and want to actually follow along, you can do that. There's actually QR codes around the church. You can get it ahead of time, or you can do it now if you really feel inclined. Between the ages of 6 and 11, basically from the start of the first grade to the end of the fifth grade, my dad was a pastor of a small country church. 2 country churches, actually. The 2 churches were just under 30 miles apart, and we lived in one of those 2 small towns. Now, for those of you that aren't really familiar with the geography, we lived there. In the middle of Saskatchewan, which you can see is north of North Dakota and Montana. And in this place, this little town, was called Nokomis. I still remember the town sign, population 526, right? That was the population of our town. That is the extent of the town, right? 4 streets by 4 streets. There were 2 paper routes. I don't know how it could support 2, and I know because I had one, my brother had the other. And so we did this, and my dad also pastored this town about 25, 30 minutes away called Raymore. There was 4 of us, 4 kids at that time, including 3 boys. My entire grade at the local school was 7 people. And that included all the farm kids that got bussed in. When we had a deep snow blizzard, the buses generally didn't make it, so then our class would only be like 3, right? So it was that kind of school. And the church that we were in, one of the 2 churches that my dad pastored, provided a parsonage, which for those of you that aren't familiar with the term, it's the church owns the housing, and so we lived in there. But it wasn't as though money was abundant. These were small churches in a small place, and we didn't notice it a lot, but when I spoke with my parents years later, there were many times where there just simply wasn't enough. And so God had to provide in miraculous ways, and they didn't give that stress to us kids, but I heard stories later of how God would do these amazing things, how He would provide, because we didn't have a lot. Someone would just show up, and a farmer would say, "Hey, I have an entire side of beef for you guys, can you use it?" And it would fill this massive freezer. We'd have meat for an entire winter, entire season, when we weren't even expecting that. And so my mom and dad would tell stories after stories of how God would provide over and over in this time, particularly in this time, when the kids were young. And it's a lesson that God has proven out in my life over and over and over again. That He's a God who is with and provides. Many of you have similar, in many cases, some amazing stories of how God has done that in your lives. Well, we're almost at the end of this series on lessons from the desert. And what we've said from the very beginning is that the underlying truth, the thing that we're trying to look at as we look at this metaphor of Israel wandering through the desert from Egypt to the Promised Land, is that we go through times in our life where we're in the desert, right? They can be huge, where we lose a spouse, someone's sick, we have financial crisis and it lasts forever, or we can have these little small deserts, the ones that last for a week or 2 weeks or a month. But in each case, where we want to be, what we would love to see happen, isn't where we are. And so we're in this in-between space, and in that in-between space is really fertile ground for transformation. And what we said was that in that, we have a choice. That transformation is going to go one of 2 ways. Either it's going to go toward this God-designed transformation where we become who He wants us to be and actually grow and become more fully everything He's designed, or we are transformed into people who are bitter or angry or disillusioned because of the desert. And so far, we've looked at the dangers of a complaining heart, right? And the difference between a complaint and a lament, the problem if we try and walk alone, what that looks like. But today, I actually want to look at something that almost everybody in this room believes intellectually. You would agree with me. You'll say, absolutely, I know this is true. And yet when we're in the middle of the desert, we often act like we don't believe this is true. Because one of the problems of the desert is that it feels like we have to fend for ourselves. We're in the middle of this, things aren't going, nobody seems to be looking out for us, God doesn't even seem to be looking out for us, and I kind of got to take it into our own hands, because the nature of a desert is desperation, right? We do what you do to survive. And when we're in the desert, it's easy to feel like beat up and isolated, impoverished, and it can be all kinds of things, right? Like that daily grind, where care for an elderly parent, for year after year after year. It's the ongoing battle where you're like, you know what? We always are struggling to pay the next bill. When will it ever get where I don't have to do that? Or it's that passionate desire to see our children come to Jesus, and they're so far away, and in fact, they seem to be getting further away. It's that battle with sickness that drags on forever or ever. Or that depression, you know, the one that never really seems to lift. There's better days and there's worse days, but it lays over top of you for months and months and months. And what happens in the middle of that is doubt creeps in, because we say, look, I know God loves me, but I mean, does he really? I know that's what they say. Weldon says that on Sunday, but I don't know. Or we think, what's wrong with me? What's my problem? What lesson am I not learning here? Like, what am I not getting that God is trying to teach me so I can move on to the next thing? Like, what is God doing? Or what does God really think of me to let me stay in this place? Like, I'm not sure I know what's going on. And they're natural questions. They're questions most of us ask in various ways, but they can be devastating if we haven't internalized this truth that we're going to look at today. Because what if God actually loves to provide for you? I mean, what if God just loves reminding you that you're not alone, that he is with you? What if you have a God who treasures you, adores you, wants you to be whole? What if you have a God who sees your fatigue, understands your desert, and is actually concerned about you? I mean, what if God loves providing the right thing at the right time, exactly when you need it, and he just delights in doing that? What if seeing us and providing for us in the desert is actually just what he does? I mean, I wonder if we lived like all those things were true all the time, what would change? How would we respond differently? Well, we're going to return to the Israelites because that's where we've been going all this. And the Israelites are going through the desert, and their desert experiences between leaving Egypt when they were slaves and arriving in this promised land where God said, look, I'm going to pour blessings out. You're going to have more than you need. You're going to have an abundance. It's remember the term, the land flowing with milk and honey, right? Which, of course, when I was a kid, thought, well, that sounds terrible, right? But what it was symbolic of you don't need anything. I mean, there's going to be so much here. It'll be more than you'll ever need. And if you remember the story, they experienced God's miraculous provision in the way that most people in history have never seen. I mean, yet they continually struggled to trust God, that he was there, and it was carried. And here's why. It's because their circumstances were their measuring stick for what they thought about who God was. And what was around them was what they decided. I don't know if you saw this in the news. This was literally, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago? Megan Rapinoe. Does anybody know who that is? Just a couple of you? No. She's a player, a very famous player on the women's national soccer team. She's had a long career, done lots, and so she's kind of doing her swan song, and she's going to play her last game. You remember seeing this, right? And she was 6 minutes into her last game, which was supposed to be her big send-off and a big celebration, and she tore her Achilles. Out of the game, that's how her career ends. And when they interviewed her after, she said, this is messed up, and this is proof that there is no God. And I thought, well, that's interesting. She was saying exactly what the Israelites said all the time. These circumstances are terrible. You know what? That just proves that God doesn't care, that he's not there, because if he did, my circumstances wouldn't be what they are. And the problem is when our circumstances are the primary measuring stick for whether or not God cares, do you know what happens? Up and down and up and down. And if you're in a bad season where you're down, you stay down because the circumstances are just, they're not good. And this is what happens to Israel time and time again. But here's the principle for this morning. God is the God who sees. Now, I'm going to look at a whole bunch of verses this morning. So sometimes, and in fact, most times, I usually camp out in one passage. But this morning, I want to go over a bunch of different ones in the story. And some we've seen, some are new. But this began when Israel was still in Egypt, right? They were already in an emotional desert. I mean, they were in Egypt, but they were still in the desert because life was a mess. They were miserable. They were complaining to God. And if you remember, God picks Moses. He's been in the wilderness for 40 years after running away from Egypt, and he has this whole burning bush experience. And do you remember what God told him? I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them cry out because of their slave drivers. I am concerned about their suffering. They had not gone unnoticed. They hadn't slipped through the heavenly cracks. God cared about them. But I was thinking about this verse this week, and I thought, well, to care about something, I'm not sure that that's an adequate word, right? If someone said, well, God cares about you, you're like, yeah, okay, I care. But there's something different when you really begin to think about it. Like, I care about the people and the children in other countries that are starving. I really do. Like, I care for them. I mean, it's a thing. But when I went to India, and I spent 2 weeks, and I got to go into the orphanage and see and touch and be around and interact with, completely different. The word care takes on this meaning that I've never had before. I mean, I used to have a compassion. I sympathized with couples who struggled to get pregnant. They just, they would have these struggles. They couldn't have kids. And I'd be like, oh, yeah, that's too bad. I really do care. And I did care until we met people and became friends with those who were agonizing their way through this. And all of a sudden, the care became so much deeper because we saw their tears, they shared their anguish, and everything changed. As long as we think God is someone who sees from afar and just intellectually loves and cares for us, the desert will be more difficult than it needs to be. God repeatedly reminded the Israelites, I am the God who sees you. Now, it comes out in a variety of ways, but let me look at 4 that come out through this entire story that I think will be helpful for us. Here's the first one. I am the God who feels. God gets your situation. Not what you think. He does. Let's go back to what that verse just said. Look at this. God says 3 things to Moses. He says, I have indeed seen the misery. The Hebrew word here isn't just to see like as in to watch or to, like I saw the sign from far away. It actually implies attentiveness, a paying really to listen intelligently, to look at, to be engaged with. And then he says, I've heard them. The word again that's used here is for a deep concern. There is not just a kind of a surfacey thing, but there's I'm feeling with you. I'm experiencing this alongside of you. The depths of your pain and suffering are my pain and suffering. And then he says, I am concerned. I want the best for you. I feel what you feel, and I want it to be different. See, here's the logic. And this was that Megan who had that statement, that soccer player. This is the logic. If God was real and he felt the way I feel, he would do something about it. Right? I mean, if God really felt what I felt, understood what I hurt, because when I hurt with someone, my kids hurt, what do? Everything I can to help them out. I don't want them to hurt. I hate it when they're like this. I don't want them to be like this. What can I do to help? And so our logic is that God looks at us, and if he really got what was going on, then he would step in, and he would do what I think he should do for me. If God really got me, since he's God, he can do whatever he wants. And I have usually a very clear picture in my head of what that looks like. Right? When I know that God should get involved, I know what that would look like. And if he doesn't, I think things like, well, then what's wrong with God? Or, if I don't want to go down that path, well, what's wrong with me? And when God is talking to Israel, he says, look, guys, you need to understand. I get it. I feel with you. I am not callous. I am in this. I know you're not where you want to be yet, but I am with you. I feel this with you deeply. I get your emotion. I'm not ignoring you. In fact, I'm going to be really active in your desert journey, but I see a bigger picture. I'm actually doing something really good. By the way, this is such a big deal, right? And you all know this because there is something about having a friend who gets you that changes everything, isn't it? That's why they have support groups. It's why you have, an Alex, AA, and it's why you have recovery groups. It's why you have, groups of people who've lost their spouses and now they're widows and widowers. It's why you have groups of people who've lost their kids. Why? It's because when you gather with people who've experienced the same thing you have, there's something good about that. Because when they say, I get you, you're like, yeah, you do. And so when they say, well, here's what worked for me, you're listening because you're like, you understand. That is God, who feels, who gets it. And that changes everything, because when someone is like that, you are willing to talk to them and you're willing to listen to them. But there's more to that. It's not just that. That's amazing. But he also says, I'm the God who protects. You might not think so, but I am the God who protects. And the Israelites' journey is actually a whole series of amazing protection experiences. And the first occurs, they've just left Egypt. I mean, they haven't figured anything out. They're basically a big mob that's kind of walking in this direction because Moses told them to. And you remember what happens, right? Pharaoh changes his mind and says, that was a mistake. We just lost all the eldest. You know what? They're going to pay. He takes out his whole army. He pursues them. And the people, of course, they see this coming. They panic, which makes sense, right? What's going to happen? We're all going to die. Moses, what have you done? But look what God says. Because they said to Moses, because there's no graves in Egypt that you brought us in the desert to die? Like, what have you done by bringing us out into this Egypt? Didn't we say to you, Egypt, leave us alone? Which they didn't, by the way. They were crying out to God for deliverance. Let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than die in the desert. Right? And by the way, that's what we do in the desert. We make these comparisons. Anything would be better than this, God. Moses answered the people, do not be afraid. Stand firm. You will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. And look what he says. You need only to be still. Stop for a second. I got this. I'm God. And you know what happened, right? God parted the water, led them through, destroyed the Egyptian army. But I'm telling you, what caught my attention this week were those last words, you need only to be still. Let me care for you. Stop trying to fix your desert right now. You can't. I can, and I can protect you, so let me. And the end of the chapter, where they talk about this, we see that. It's when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Israelites, what was the result? The people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. Oh, I wish that had lasted. But as we've seen so far, they quickly forgot that God was on their side. And yet, God continued to do this. If you go a little bit further, there's a whole story of the Amalekites who came and attacked them, right? They're wandering. The Amalekites thought, here's a chance to wipe out an entire group of people and take everything that's theirs. And if you remember the story, God defeated them. That was when Moses was on the top of the mountain and he had to hold his hands in the air. It's a great story. And they end up defeating the Amalekites, even though they had no experience in battle. I mean, they were just been slaves. These are people who'd been beaten their whole lives. They didn't know how to fight a war. And yet God saves them. When Moab wanted to curse them, if you remember this story, this is the talking donkey story. If you haven't read this, again, read your Bibles. It's awesome. They have this whole thing where the king of Moab says, you have to curse these people. They're too strong. And so he tells Balaam, I want you to curse them. And God instead spins it around, protects the Israelites. They didn't even know what was happening. God was still protecting them. God is always there protecting. How many of you have seen the movie Prince Caspian? The C.S. Lewis one? Yeah, a few of you have. It's from this. C.S. Lewis wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. And in Prince Caspian is one of the books in that series. Aslan, of course, in the entire series is representative of Christ, of God, and he does all these adventures. And there's one really great scene in Prince Caspian where it's kind of coming to the ultimate, where the entire enemies are coming, the Telmarines are coming in, and they're about to attack. And Lucy, the youngest, just little girl, is the only one who trusts that Aslan will do what Aslan's going to do. Not if you remember the scene, but she comes to the bridge where they're coming, and she walks onto the bridge, and she pulls out, and all she's got is a little knife against a whole army. And then behind her, Aslan walks out of the woods and takes over, and she doesn't have to do anything. God is a God who protects. He's standing behind us. He's saying, I've got this, guys. Ladies, I'm in the business of protection. Sometimes we see it. I think many more times we're never aware of it. but he is on your side and he is for you, and that is such good news. He never thinks bad thoughts about you. He's a God who sees, which means he's a God who feels with you. He's a God who protects. But it goes even further. We see that he tells them over and over, I'm the God who provides. Because he didn't just protect the Israelites, he provided for them. Right? We saw this. Let's review a few. First, they came to Marah. The waters were bitter. Remember this story? They couldn't drink it. And so God heals the waters. Moses throws the wood in the water. It becomes perfectly sweet to drink, and it's all good. And he provides. Then they needed food. So God gave them this heavenly bread, right? Manna. And they got that every day. Then they got thirsty again. And so Moses hit a rock, and water comes out, and a whole spring comes up, and they have that. And when the people complained about manna, they wanted meat. We talked a little bit about this, but we didn't delve into this story completely. When Moses came to God, remember this is where he lamented because the people were so angry because all they had was manna and they wanted meat. Look, this is a great exchange. Remember, this is the God who provides. Look at this. So Moses comes, he's lamenting this all to God, and then God says this. He says, tell the people, consecrate yourselves. In other words, get ready, make yourself holy, in preparation for tomorrow, when you will eat meat. The Lord heard you when you wailed, if only we had meat to eat. We were better off in Egypt. Now the Lord will give you meat, and you will eat it. You will not eat it for just 1 day, or 2 days, or 5, 10, or 20, but for a whole month until it comes out of your nostrils and you loathe it. Right? You kind of get a picture of a parent saying, look, you want the Halloween candy? Fine. You can have it all. You can eat it all, and tomorrow's on you, right? You just kind of get that picture, right? Because you've rejected the Lord who's among you, and you've wailed before him, saying, why did we ever leave Egypt? But then listen to this. Moses said, here I am among 600,000 men on foot, and you say I will give them meat to eat for a whole month? They wouldn't even have enough if all the flocks and herds were slaughtered for them. Would they have enough if all the fish in the sea were caught for them? Like, okay, God, that sounds nice. This ain't going to work. You can't do this. Look at the Lord's answer. Is the Lord's arm too short? You will see whether or not what I say will come true for you. You doubt me? You're doubting my power? You're doubting my ability and my desire to supply what is desired and needed? You don't think I can. You don't think I will. All questions that we do say when we are in the desert. You doubt my presence? You think there's a better reality? Well, you know what? The account tells us what happens, right? You remember the story? All of a sudden, the next morning, there's a wind. Starts as a breeze, starts to pick up. And the wind blows in probably a migratory swarm of quail. And the scriptures tell us that they covered the ground a couple of feet deep for a day's walk in every direction, okay? We're talking millions of birds. I was just having a conversation with someone in the church this morning who likes to hunt, and they were saying they were getting a little tired of it after, you kill a few deer, and you're like, all right, I can move on now. Can you imagine this many quail? At first, they're like, this is amazing, and they grab 2, they grab 3, they start plucking and defeathering, and then they're like, okay, now what? And there's more, and there's more, and there's more. Like, he didn't just provide, he went over the top. Now, I hope you notice that when God provides for their needs, they're still not ever in the promised land. Every time he provided, they were still in the desert. They were still there. Their circumstances hadn't changed in that sense, but he still provided. God's provision looks different in every single context. Sometimes his provision is just a timely email or a text of encouragement where you say, oh, I needed that today. Sometimes it's just a well-timed teaching that you saw online or that you heard that just brings clarity to your situation. You thought, I'd never thought of that before. Sometimes it's just a friend who sits down and asks what you're doing, and you finally have someone to talk to. Sometimes it's that unexpected check where the boss just walks in and says, hey, you've been doing a good job, and you're like, oh my goodness, where did this come from? God just gave me some extra. Or someone walks up to you and says, you know what, I appreciate all you're doing. Let me give you something. Comfort, encouragement, finances, relationship, help, assistance, peace, hope. God's like, I love doing this stuff. But every time he provided for Israel, he had a greater purpose. Every time he was inviting them to something deeper, he's saying, look, I'm providing for you, so come on, lean in, trust me. I'm proving that I feel for you. I'm proving that I'm there, I'm protecting, and I want to provide for you. You know this is true because we're told in the midst of them eating this quail, God sent a plague that killed some. Because he says, I'm providing for you, but you're not getting this. You're doubting me. You don't need to doubt. They were doubting his power and his ability, but more importantly, they were doubting his character because they didn't think he cared. Who it was, his very nature. And yet, God says, look, this is what I do. This is who I am. I'm not stingy. I'm a God who provides. You cannot trust someone who you don't think has your best interests at heart. You just can't. You will always reserve some of yourself away from someone like that. If you want to be fully engaged and fully trust and fully listen to God, then you have to say, I trust you completely. As the God who sees, the God who feels, the God who protects, the God who provides, and the God who guides. In addition to everything else that God did for Israel while they were in the desert, he guided them. You remember this. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. And what's interesting is this actually became a defining mark for their nation. This wasn't just one of those things that, okay, this is cool. It was inside the family and Israel knew what it was all about. No. It was way bigger than that. Because actually, if you go a bit later when God is angry with the nation because they hadn't listened, they had sinned again, and Moses is interceding for them, what he says is that, God, you have to keep doing this. This is a mark that shows that we're not the same as everybody else. Look what he says. If you're angry, he says, then they're going to tell the inhabitants of the land about this. I mean, they've already heard that you, Lord, are with these people, that you, Lord, have been seen face to face, that your cloud stays over them, that you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. In other words, it was known. Other countries had heard about this. People had probably come to check it out. This is amazing. This is a God who's actively engaged with his people to lead them where they need to go. And of course, it's very interesting to me the route that God took them through the desert. If you ever had one of those old Bibles that have, an actual physical Bible, right? Some of you still do, where it has the maps in the back, right? When I was really bored as a kid, I looked at those maps a lot because if there was no children's church, and I loved my dad, but I was 8, so the sermons weren't all that interesting. And so I would look at my Bible, and I would look at the maps, and I would look at the routes. And do you remember? They would show you the route of Israel as they went through the desert. Did you ever look at it and go, what is wrong with them? Like, there's a straight line here. And God does this. He takes them. He's guiding them. Remember, he's leading them by cloud and fire, and he is going all over the place. And yeah, okay, there's mountains and there's things you got to walk around, but it's way bigger than that. God seemed to take them in weird directions. He would have them delay in strange places. There were times when they wanted to hurry, and God said, no, we're going to settle here for a few months, a few years. And yet the whole time, he was guiding them. He physically led them where they go. He knew how they needed to be guided. He knew what they needed to develop. The reason he spent 2 years in getting them from Egypt to the Promised Land was he said, if I do this too quick, you will not learn what you need to know before you get there. And you will get there unprepared and not ready for the blessings that I want to pour into your life. So this is a training ground. And what we're going to see as we close the series the next couple of weeks is, unfortunately, they didn't listen. They didn't learn. And they spent their entire lives in the desert. God is leading. He's teaching. He's guiding. When we're in the desert, it doesn't mean that God made a mistake. It doesn't mean that there's something here that's wrong. God's saying, look, I get it. I feel with you. I really do. I understand this. I feel you deeper than you possibly can understand. And I am more active in protecting and providing for you than you will ever know. But trust me, I'm guiding you. I will guide you through this desert time in your life if you trust me. God is the God who sees. He's the God who feels. I'm the God who protects. He says, I'm the God who provides. I am the God who guides. Now let me go all the way back to what I said at the beginning. This is not an issue of knowledge. Okay? The Israelites who are going through all this knew their history. They'd been raised on it. They knew that God called Abraham. They knew that God had taken Abraham from his country, brought him into a new place. They'd heard the stories of how God provided the sacrifice of Isaac, the way that God had provided the last second. They'd seen all this. They'd heard the stories. They knew how God had provided for them by taking Joseph into Egypt. They knew the stories of how the famine came and how God... This wasn't an issue that they didn't know that God provided. But in the midst of their desert, all of that became faraway intellectual knowledge, and they forgot, and they did not act as though it was true. The challenge for every person, my guess is, in this room, is not that we look at this and go, wow, never heard of that before. Maybe you haven't. But for most of us, we're like, yeah, I know all that. But when we're in the desert, we have to say, okay, not only do I know that, I'm going to live like it is true. We want to experience God as the one who sees. So when you're in the desert, what do you believe? See, he feels with you because he wants you to lean into him. And so if you want to live this out, be quick to go to him when you're in the desert. Do you believe that he sees, that he cares, that he's right beside you? That he feels with you? That he weeps with you? That he understands your loneliness or your fatigue or your frustration or your impatience? Do you really believe that he understands the deepest desires of your heart? If that's true, then run to him. He protects you because he's looking out for your good. He wants you to trust him. He's not trying to ruin you. He's watching over you. So do you believe that he's in your corner? Do you believe that he's actually looking out for you, protecting your best interests? That he sees things that you don't see? That he's protecting you from stuff that you're not even aware of? That he sees the bigger picture? The things that could derail your life? He's saying, trust me. He provides for you because he loves you. He wants you to rely on him. He's like, I love doing this. Trust me, rely on me. To lavishly provide. He says, I want you to have confidence in me. If you want to live like this is true, then say, all right, God, I believe you'll provide. You're not withholding things to punish me. He's not disappointed in you. He actually loves to provide for you. And he's a God who guides because he wants intimacy with you. This whole idea of guiding, it's because he wants you to listen to him, to spend time with him, to be around him. If you truly believe he guides, our response should be, I want more of him. Do you believe that he's guiding you? That he wants you to follow him? That he actually has a plan? That he wants you to submit and trust? That you're actually not better off without him? Do you believe all those things? More importantly, are you living like they are true? Ran across a great quote. It said this: there are times when God allows us, as he did the Israelites, and as he did Moses, to suffer need. This might be physical, emotional, spiritual, material, or relational. Such needs have a tendency either to discourage and debilitate us or to drive us into God's presence where we will ask for his guidance and provision. God sees us, everything about us. He knows our need, and he is trustworthy. He wants us to learn to trust him to provide. So when we're in the middle of your desert, next time that happens, whether it's now or in the future, just remember, God is a God who sees. He's a God who feels with you. This is a God who protects you. A God who wants to provide for you. The God who guides